What messed up thing did your school do? Junior high. Students were locked into the lunch area during lunch period to prevent students roaming the halls. I didn't realize how dangerous it was, e.g., in case of fire, until one day some kid poured super glue in one of the locks as a prank, and everyone started to get claustrophobic and freak out.
That sounds pretty intense. I can imagine the panic in that lunch area. It's wild how a prank went so wrong. Being locked in, especially with a potential fire risk, is no joke. I've heard of similar situations where things escalated quickly. Sometimes, the smallest decisions can make a big difference in how safe everyone feels. It's good that nothing serious happened. Just a reminder to always think things through.
As a fundraiser last year, my school played What Does the Fox Say for a week over the PA system during passing periods. You could pay to stop the song, and they were going to stop it once they met their goal. Doesn't seem too awful at first, but throughout the week, they made the song progressively louder, and by the middle of the week, they had dropped the words in the song and were just playing the ding, 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 ding at obnoxiously loud volumes. Teachers started to disconnect their PA systems in their rooms. Students were complaining of migraines. Everyone was just super pissy about the situation. You'd think the lesson was learned, but they did same goddamn fundraiser this year.
That sounds annoying. Playing the same song every day and cranking up the volume would drive anyone crazy. It's wild how they thought doing it again this year was a good idea. You'd think they'd find a better way to fundraise after all the complaints. Seems like some lessons just don't get learned, no matter how loud the noise gets. I guess they really wanted to make a point, even if it wasn't the right one.
During the national AP exams, there was a really big case where this girl cheated on one of the exams. She literally wrote notes on her arms and covered it with her sleeves. Probably one of the most idiotic things I ever heard. And what's more surprising is that she's president of numerous academic/community service organizations. A girl like that should be smarter. Anyway, the whole school was at risk of getting all the students' AP scores canceled and potentially be the joke of all the school district. So, the board members of the school paid some hush money to the right people so news wouldn't go past the school gates. The girl got away with a slap on the wrists. Everyone's scores were safe, and the college board never heard of the news. Talk about extremely shady.
It's wild when you think about how someone can be so involved and still make such a dumb move. Writing notes on your arms? You'd think she'd know better, especially in her position. It's interesting how things can be swept under the rug when the stakes are high. The whole school faced consequences, but in the end, it was all about saving face. Just shows how messy things can get when people prioritize image over integrity.
This wasn't my school, but my school's main rival, that's what you would call it, tried to ban the color red. Like flat out no red. Shirts, buttons, hair. I shit you not if your hair was a little too red, even if I was natural, I would punish you. They didn't ban the color blue, so I'm pretty sure their school was run by the Crips.
That's a wild story. Imagining a school trying to ban a color is pretty out there. I mean, who gets to decide what's an acceptable color? Seems pretty strict and kind of absurd. It's funny how school rivalries can lead to such odd rules. Makes you wonder what other strange things they might come up with. It's just hair, right? But I guess some places take their rivalries pretty seriously.
Every scholarship a senior applied for had to go through the counselors at the school. The counselors then were later busted for selecting only the applications of their favorite students and sending those and tossing the rest. My brother went behind their backs and did his scholarships around town himself. The counselors found out about this and threatened him. Messed up.
It's pretty wild how some people play favorites. My brother just wanted a fair shot, so he took matters into his own hands. I can't imagine getting threatened for trying to help yourself out. It's strange how the system works sometimes, but he kept his head down and did what he had to do. It's a tough experience, but he learned a lot from it.
Recently, my sister's high school only let the Year 7 kids go out to watch the eclipse and made the Year 8/9S stay inside. She was telling me that some of the teachers even shut the curtains so the older kids would carry on working. These kids are like 13 to 14. They've never seen a total eclipse before. And the teachers wouldn't let them take 15 minutes to go outside and look.
That's kind of wild. I mean, I get wanting to keep kids focused, but missing a total eclipse? It seems like a missed opportunity for them to experience something unique. I remember when my school let everyone out for a solar eclipse. It was cool. People were just looking up and enjoying it together. A little break for an event like that can be a good memory. It's just a shame they didn't get to see it.
In my senior year, our class was called to the auditorium, and nobody knew what the gathering was for. We sat for 15 minutes in silence until our VP came out with a microphone and said, "Look left, look right. One of you will die this year." Then 5 more minutes of silence. Then we got to leave. Turns out there was a curse that every 2 years in our school, someone from the senior class dies in a preventable accident.
That's pretty heavy for a school meeting. I can't imagine sitting there in silence, just waiting for something meaningful to come out of it. The whole idea of a curse adds a weird layer. It's not something you expect to hear in high school. I wonder how that affected everyone, knowing that kind of history. Makes you think about life and how fragile it can be. Definitely a day to remember, I guess.
Ruined the school cafeteria. Freshman year had decent, wholesome food for lunch. By the end of the year, it was the exact same fucking shit every day. The cafeteria was basically where you met up to go off campus to get food. Really sucked for the disenfranchised kids who were forced to eat the free meal for lunch. Spent $14 million swapping the entire district out to Apple everything, even Apple servers. Then they bought a massive swimming complex nobody ever uses. Then guess what? Time for budget cuts. The new IT director made everybody go back to PCs. Smartboards. A few posters below reminded me of this. It was a failed program at our school. The teachers all but abandoned them because the driver software was shit and the support was non-existent. Turns out a whiteboard is all you need.
Sounds like the cafeteria really dropped the ball. Freshman year was decent, but by the end, it was just a sad repeat of the same food. The budget on tech didn't pay off either. Swapping everything to Apple and building that swimming complex was a waste if no one used it. And the smart boards just added to the mess, when simple whiteboards worked just fine. Just typical school mismanagement.
We had a school lockdown because an armed escape convict ran into our school. They said nothing at all. Anyone that was already in the hallways were automatically suspended. No one got hurt. Cops got to them. But seriously, so stupid. It's a good idea to tell why there's a lockdown, so people will listen.
That sounds pretty intense. Lockdowns can be really scary, especially when no one knows what's going on. It's frustrating that people got suspended for just being in the wrong place. Clear communication could have made things a lot less chaotic. Glad to hear everyone was okay in the end, though. Makes you appreciate the importance of safety and knowing what's happening around you.
I went to a very small school. We had 3 classes and 4 teachers. The senior class was taught by the principal and vice principal. The vice principal was nicknamed the Dragon Lady, and during her lessons, she would randomly scream, "Duck!" And you would have to jump under your desk as fast as you could, because she would throw whatever was in her hand across the room. Also, we would have a desk cleaning on the last day of term, and whichever kid had really annoyed them would have to stand in the middle of the room while we all threw rubbish at them. And boys that wouldn't stop low riding their pants would have to wear a netball skirt for the rest of the day.
That sounds chaotic. Small schools can have their quirks. The vice principal seems like a real character with that duck routine. Jumping under desks must have made class interesting. The desk cleaning game is wild. Talk about a unique way to deal with troublemakers. And those boys wearing skirts for low riding? That's a bold punishment. I guess it all adds to the experience of growing up in such a close-knit school.
In 1990, I went to a small, private school a little north of New Orleans. When we went on the tour to look at it, the principal had a lot of great things to say and was a friendly woman. My pops took on an extra job, so I could go there, and about 3 months into the school year, the principal took an odd turn. Suddenly, I had to buy special school-approved socks. We had uniforms, but that wasn't part of it. I had to buy special school-approved windbreakers. She confiscated a Lisa Frank binder I was carrying because she wasn't sure about it, which I still don't know what she mean. Twice she canceled field trips the day of and canceled one while we were on the way there. Right near the conclusion of my time there, the principal found out she had a brain tumor and apologized for any erratic decisions she made. She died about 18 months after that school year ended.
It's strange how a place can feel welcoming and then turn into something else. Our expectations can crash pretty hard. I had a similar experience where a friendly vibe shifted, but in my case, it was over some new rules that didn't make sense. It's sad to hear about the principal, though. Life can really throw curveballs, and sometimes we just don't get to know the full story behind people's actions.
I'm reading some of these answers and thinking, I'm glad none of this happened in my school, but when I read /clever sexual innuendo story, I remember I had a similar experience, albeit with only one teacher. I was in primary school, about 10-11 years old. Instead of AM's 16 report, I wrote a fantasy story of goblins, skeletons, and the like having a war. About a week later, my teacher brought in my parents for a little talk. Not sure why at the time. Turns out she had concerns over my mental health. My dad, a man who has limited patience to stupidity, said something along the lines of, he's a kid, he's got an imagination just like everyone else. Go fuck yourself, before storming out, leaving my mother to apologize whilst I'm staring in awe.
That sounds like a wild experience. It's interesting how a teacher's concern can be taken so seriously. I had a friend who wrote something similar, and the teacher freaked out too. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Kids have wild imaginations. Honestly, it's kind of funny how parents handle those situations. Your dad's reaction shows he really had your back. Just goes to show how being creative can sometimes be misunderstood.
In high school, we had a popular kid die from autoerotic asphyxiation. A few months later, we ended up having a school assembly that was designed to scare you to death. Basically fear-mongering, traumatizing pictures. It had all these terrifying statistics, and at the end, an in memoriam that had a bunch of names of teenagers who died from doing it. His was included, of course. As if that wasn't inappropriate enough, the mom of the dead freshman got up and spoke at the end. I don't remember what all she said, but she was hysterically ranting and crying. Half the auditorium was in tears, and the other half was in shock that the administration thought this was an appropriate idea for a school assembly.
That assembly was something else. It felt like they pushed the limits on what's acceptable at school. I mean, using someone's tragic death to scare everyone into submission? Not cool. The mom's speech just added to the chaos. You could feel the mix of grief and disbelief in the room. Some of us just sat there, trying to process how this whole situation was handled. It was really heavy and kind of surreal.
In my senior year of high school, I was suspended for 3 days for tweeting about how I didn't like a teacher's method of teaching. The teacher just so happened to find that tweet on the internet one day, so the school took action and made an example out of me. The teacher was a brand new teacher and was a psychopath. She stalked all of the students on social media.
That's a wild situation. It sucks when a teacher can't handle criticism, especially when they're new. It's kind of crazy how a tweet can lead to a suspension. Guess some teachers take things way too personally. Pretty memorable way to end high school, though. At least you learned early on about the risks of speaking your mind online.
On the last day of school, freshman seniors could leave early. That left 7th to 8th graders at the school. They made us clean up the school grounds. This included, but was not restricted to, tampons, to use one not, a bunch of rusty stuff in the workshop, garbage, and dog shit. No gloves, nothing. They just walked around monitoring us. They didn't help with anything. Luckily, I was not there for one of the used tampons, the dog shit, or most of the rusty stuff because I brought $50 and I intended on spending it. I gathered up some buddies and we walked off to Pizza Hut. It was the last day of school and they couldn't do shit and still didn't the next year. By the way, I knew there was another used tampon and dog shit because a friend who couldn't go, his mom worked at the school, told me about it.
That last day sounds pretty rough. I remember a similar experience when I was in middle school. We had to clean up after a sports event, and it was just a mess. No one cared, really. Some of us decided to ditch and hit up a burger place instead. Sometimes you just have to prioritize having a good time over pointless tasks. It's funny how those moments stick with you.
A teacher at my school brought in a STI doctor for health fair, and he gave out condoms and talked about safe sex. She was almost fired because we are an abstinent district, even though we have the highest rate of teen pregnancy. I kid you not, freshmen and sophomores are walking around with huge bellies and about 4 juniors and 2 seniors. 3 had their kids since November to now.
That's a pretty intense situation. It's odd how some schools handle sex education. Instead of addressing the problem, they focus on what they think is right. You'd think providing proper information might help the situation with all those pregnancies. It's wild to see that many young parents and still have such strict policies. Looks like the real issue is being ignored while trying to maintain an image.
My school was a grammar school, which means it's still free, but entrance is based solely on ability. Not too bad in itself, but that meant that the school only cared about being top of the league tables. Accordingly, kids who began to drop grades, we're talking slipping from A's to B's, will be asked to leave, regardless of the reason for the slip. Parents divorcing? Leave. Mental health problem? Leave. Homeless? Leave. By the start of sixth form, they have gaps to fill. As such, and I swear to God this is true, they simply import smart kids in from Hong Kong for 2 years and let them stay as boarders. Every year the school would get a dozen or so new Chinese students with weirdly incongruous English names. So many Jasons.
That's an interesting take on the school system. It's crazy how they prioritize results over the well-being of students. I remember a friend who went through something similar, dealing with stress and grades. He struggled but ended up transferring to a more supportive school. Glad to see some places focus on the students rather than just rankings. Those names, though, definitely memorable. Jason's everywhere.
A cop and the superintendent of my school came to class one day and told us a group of kids died in a car crash. I believed them and started crying because one of the girls was from my class and I grew up with her. It ended up being a lie they told us to scare us into not drinking and driving. They had a huge assembly about it and everything. I got made fun of for crying and it really embarrassed me. I never trusted anything they school told me ever again. Made a no nickname policy because nicknames could be used to bully other kids. Even if your name was Jonathan and your nickname was John. The superintendent told me I needed to change the color of my hair. It was purple because it was a distraction. And I was obviously doing it because I wanted attention and should probably go see a therapist for it. Many more things like that.
That sounds rough. Getting manipulated like that, especially about something so serious, is just messed up. I can't believe they would resort to lying. The whole nickname policy seems over the top too. It's like they missed the point of school being a place to grow. and telling you to change your hair? That's just not right. It's frustrating when authority gets it so wrong. Those experiences must have stuck with you.
I went to an all-male school. Before prom, they sent out a flyer with rules about the prom. Most of it was fairly standard stuff like no alcohol/drugs and a dress code, etc. There was one rule, however, that was, you must bring a girl. At first glance, it just sounded like no going stag. Then it dawned on me.
It seems like they were trying to enforce this idea that you can't just go alone, which makes sense for a prom vibe. But then it gets a bit awkward when you realize they're essentially saying you need a date. I remember we had a mate who couldn't find anyone to go with. It made for some funny moments, but it also kinda showed how restrictive those rules can be.
I went to a high school that was primarily Asian and Jewish students. One say my friend, who is a Persian Jew, wore an I love Iran shirt to school. In his first period class, all the Israeli students started yelling at him, and the teacher sent him to the disciplinary's office. They ended up making him wear a sweatshirt over it. As a fellow Persian, I was very upset by that.
That sounds like a tough situation. It's interesting how identity can lead to conflict, even among friends. It must have been frustrating to see your friend targeted like that, especially in a place where cultural backgrounds are rich and diverse. Sometimes people forget that expressing where you come from doesn't mean you oppose someone else. It's all part of learning and figuring out how to coexist.
Our school had club days every so often, and the class I was in hosted a club, so they kicked us out. All of the clubs, except the Christian club, made you sign up or pay dues, so we found a big open area outside the gym that was having a small club gathering, and asked if we could just kind of sit in the corner and chill if we were quiet. After about 15 minutes, the assistant principal storms in and hauls us all to his office for skipping class, despite being under the direct supervision of a teacher who gave us permission to be there. Gave about 15 people suspension and searches people's backpacks and purses.
That sounds frustrating. It's wild how things turned out. You guys were just trying to hang out in a space that seemed okay. The assistant principal really didn't see the whole picture, I guess. It's strange how rules can be enforced in such a harsh way, especially when you had a teacher's permission. Getting suspended for that must have felt pretty unfair for everyone involved. Just a bad day for sure.
Kept the dumb shit chem teacher who had no clue what she was doing, but you could tell she was very social with the other teachers. And then fired the physics teacher, who was the best teacher I'd ever had. He was a stereotypical nerd. I had chem my junior year, and then physics my senior year. Their first years are the years I had them.
It's wild how schools can have those mismatches. You get a teacher who's more focused on fitting in than actually teaching. Meanwhile, the one who really makes an impact gets let go. My school had a similar situation, and I still think about how much better my last year could have been with that physics teacher. Just goes to show how much the right teacher can influence your year.
My twin brother just turned 18 the day before and got his license on his 18th birthday. He bought a car a couple weeks before, after saving up, filled it with petrol, drove to school to write an exam, and suddenly we were no longer allowed to park inside the school grounds. Apparently some kids were doing burnouts on the grass a few weeks prior. This is South Africa. You don't park a car on the street unless you don't want that car anymore. Anyways, they told us to park the thing outside the gates and claimed the security guard would look out for it. End of exam comes, we go outside to drive off like bosses. All that's left is some shattered glass. The guard had called his buddies and let them know there was a free car for the taking. To be fair, the school was very apologetic, and when the insurance paid out a few grand below what we paid for it, they actually gave us money to make up the difference.
That's a rough first day of driving for your brother. It's cool he got the car after saving up. But parking outside at that school sounds risky. It's wild that the guard just let people take it. At least the school tried to help out with the insurance. Gotta be careful where you park in places like that. Hopefully, he has better luck next time.
My grandmother taught at my high school for 30 years, so I was able to get away with a lot of shit. One thing, however, almost got me expelled. It had been snowing a lot back in 2002. I copied the HTML of our school's website and made a copy of it and declared that the next 2 days were snow day for the entire school and district. I made the URL look real by adding the @ symbol at the end and putting the fake website address, so it looked legit. I then sent the fake URL to everyone I knew via AOL Instant Messenger, and it spread like wildfire. A couple days later, I was in the principal's office with the police, my parents, principal, and superintendent. My father, an IT expert, explained I didn't actually hack the website at all, but rather just used some web trickery. The absentee rate had shot up by 1,200%, according to the superintendent. Because of my prank, I was suspended for a week, given another week of in-school suspension, and banned from the computer lab for the rest of the year. Worth it.
That sounds like a wild high school experience. I can imagine the chaos you caused with that snow day prank. It's pretty clever how you used web tricks to create that fake URL. Getting suspended must have sucked, but it sounds like you had fun in the moment. It's funny how a prank can lead to such serious consequences, but at least you have a good story to tell.
My high school banned hacky sacks because they were used for gang-related activities. Two things. My school was in rural, but fuck nowhere, Kansas, where the entire K-12 student body was 120 people. My class had a total of 9 people, myself included. Bloods? Crips? MS-13? Sounds like slang for STDs. 2. When has anybody, ever, seen anyone other than stoners or brothers play a game of hacky sack?
Seems like your school was just looking for a reason to ban something. With a small student body like that, it's hard to believe they thought hacky sacks were a gang issue. I mean, it's usually just laid-back folks trying to kill time. I guess someone in charge had a wild imagination about what that was all about. In rural Kansas, it's hard to picture it being a hotbed for gang activities.
The bathroom graffiti at public high school was so extensive, we had one full-time painter just to paint the bathrooms. He made more than most of the teachers, $30,000 a year, and it would take 1 week to fully repaint one male and female bathroom. He would start at the north end of campus and work his way to south end, then start over.
That's a wild scenario. A painter dedicated just to bathroom graffiti in a high school is something else. It's funny to think about how much effort goes into covering up what students write. Looks like he had a pretty steady gig. I wonder how the graffiti evolved over time, or if it just became the same stuff again. Must have been a strange but necessary job for that school.
I went to a somewhat snooty private school in Australia, and on a whole school assembly, it was announced that we had our first Aboriginal student. He was asked to stand up and was named to introduce him to everyone. The headmaster was well-intentioned, but totally oblivious to how inappropriate it was.
That must have been a strange situation. It's tough when schools try to celebrate diversity but miss the mark. It sounds like the headmaster had good intentions but didn't really consider how it would feel for the new student. Those moments can be awkward and uncomfortable, especially in a big setting like that. It's a reminder that context matters when making introductions.
My school had what we called the Riot 2 K-12. On this very day, it all started with one incident. I don't remember what exactly happened, and the whole school blew up. Many fights broke out, kids skipping school, lots of detentions and suspensions. That day we had to be told by the higher-ups when we could leave class and when we can go to lunch. It was so bad that the news came to our school to cover it. It was an interesting experience, especially when the school contained around 3,000 students. The funny thing is every year after that people tried planning on Twitter to recreate the riot, most of who were lame freshmen that didn't get to experience the Orignal riot. A lot of changes came from this too. We had a lot more cops hired around the school. We had to get permission to go to the restroom or leave the class at all. They even almost canceled prom for the seniors because they were a major part of why it happened. All in all, it was a fun experience, mostly because my friends and I weren't really affected by it. I miss those days sometimes.
That sounds wild. I can totally picture how chaotic it must have been with that many students. It's funny how those kinds of events manage to become a tradition of sorts. Trying to recreate it every year must have felt a bit desperate too. It's ironic how a crazy day led to more rules and security changes. But yeah, sometimes those experiences stick with you, especially when you weren't really caught up in the drama.
My econ teacher said some valid criticism jokingly during an observation. The school responded by transferring him, then telling the students that he left on his own accord in the middle of the year, effectively turning a whole class of students rabid against a good man. They then didn't get a replacement teacher until the day of the final exam, 7 to 8 weeks without a teacher, leaving the whole class of seniors to fail a class, which was a graduation requirement. Good old Paul, our Wharton High School. Edit, oh yeah, and to put icing on the cake, he was retiring that year.
That's a rough situation. It's tough when someone tries to do their job well and ends up in a mess like that. You'd think the school would protect the teacher, especially with retirement on the line. It's weird how the students ended up being the ones caught in the crossfire. Losing a teacher before finals is just messed up. They could have handled it much better.
I had a bio teacher who was a real activist for the environment, go figure. With the students, he went through the effort of growing prairie grasses and different foliage. Between getting the school's approval and actually growing the plants, this took years. One year, the school decided a turf field was the way to go. The plot of land in the way? Well, during class one day, the teacher and students heard large lawn mowing equipment in a very uncommon area. They all realized what was happening and ran outside to protest, but it was too late. The school had mowed over that plot of land. The teacher and students broke down and cried. A lot of students were furious and tried to get things reversed, but the administration couldn't care less.
That's a tough situation. It's hard when you put so much effort into something, only to see it undone. The passion the teacher had for the environment clearly inspired students. The destruction of their work must have felt like a huge loss. It's frustrating when decisions like that are made without regard for the hard work behind them. It shows how important it is to advocate for what you believe in.
How about even having kids sell shit? In middle school, we had some guy give a presentation to encourage us to sell magazine subscriptions. By doing so, we earned little cheap toys that could be redeemed for larger cheap toys. It wasn't until years later that I remembered this even happened and realized how fucked up it was. I hope to God that money went to the school.
Yeah, I remember those days. Some company gets kids to sell stuff for cheap prizes, thinking it's a great idea. We were out there hustling for toy trinkets. It seems pretty messed up looking back, especially if the money didn't even help the school. Just feels like another way for someone to profit off kids' efforts. Wonder how many other schools did the same thing.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.